Welcome to Media Reporter. My name is Erika Andresen, and I will be your host this evening for a topic discussion on same-sex marriage. This topic is hot. The Supreme Court handed down a decision allowing for people to engage in non-traditional sexual activities. A lot of support has been garnered recently for a constitutional amendment. Now, folks, this is major because constitutional amendments don't happen that often, where they want to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Now, recently at New York Law School, the Justice Action Center hosted the American Civil Liberties Union, which supports same-sex unions, and the American Center for Law and Justice, which does not support same-sex unions, to a debate on the topic of whether same-sex couples should be denied the freedom to marry. Now, this program lasted almost 2 hours long, so in the interest of time, I have summarized the basic arguments and have selected portions of the program to show you. Now, speaking for the ACLJ, which don't forget they are against same-sex unions, Vincent McCarthy, who is also from the Center for Marriage Law, argued that in American society, it has been taken for granted that marriage is a man and a woman. Evan Wolfson from the ACLU and also from Freedom to Marry argues, why is it that committed couples, this can include a man and a man, a woman and a woman, or even a man and a woman, why they cannot be afforded the same protection as everybody else in society. This can include work benefits, wills, favorable tax treatment. Mr. McCarthy argued that men and women are sexually compatible and defined sex as an action involving male and female genitalia and as a union of the flesh. Mr. Wolfson retorted with the idea that this debate revolved around civil, not religious unions, and as such, religious beliefs should not be forced upon the public. Mr. McCarthy said that recognizing and protecting gay marriage would cheapen the institute of marriage because, in his opinion, and the opinion of the ACLJ, gay marriages are short, they are unstable, and they lack monogamy. And also in regard to the home sweet home, children need a stable environment to grow up in, and they need a stable relationship from a mother and a father figure, something that is impossible to have in a same-sex union. Mr. Wolfson retorted with citing 4 examples of history since 1948 where the Institute of Marriage was changed somehow, and the plague that the ACLJ fears would strike upon this earth if it happened again did not come about. These changes include the end to the restriction on race in marriage, the end of seeing women as having second-class status to their husbands in marriage, also the end to the prevention of allowing divorces in marriages where the wife is abused by the spouse, and also the separation of the idea of marriage from the idea of having children and using contraceptives. Mr. Wolfson also supported his argument with an excellent quote by Martin Luther King Jr. The quote goes as follows: "Races don't fall in love and get married. People fall in love and get married." Let's see how this debate unfolds.
If I understand correctly the gist of what Evan was saying, he was talking about not discriminating in many areas of our society. But for me, discrimination is the beginning of wisdom. We always need to discriminate among goods. We need to discriminate among good and evil. We certainly would not be in favor of bringing back Nazi organizations. We would say that that's not a good thing. We're opposed to that. We don't like that. We're not in favor, most of us, of man-boy organizations that would take young boys, often under the age of 16, 15, 14, and teach them the sexual world. We're not in favor of lowering the statutory rape age to 10 years old. There are many, many things that we all agree are important areas in which we have to discriminate in order to elevate the society in which we live and to make the society even better. So I disagree wholeheartedly with the idea that we can't discriminate. And I think that there are areas where there are discriminations, or there are differences coming in now with polyamory and polygamy. As I understand it, the ACLJ does take a position that those are allowable form. ACLU, yeah, those are allowable.
I'm glad we got a new ally.
So, you know, that's everything else. I think in terms of what Evan said, I have very little disagreement with, but I do disagree that we can't discriminate in these areas and make intelligent decisions on those bases.
Should we just do it here? Do you want us to just do it here?
I can just switch, go to the audience, or do you want to respond?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, obviously, as Professor McCarthy knows, there are many meanings of the word discriminate. I certainly don't mean discriminate that one cannot make intelligent distinctions, but that's very different from turning that into a license to discriminate, as I was using the word. The question I framed, and I think the question that this debate framed, is what is the reason, what is the justification, what grounds does the government have for its discriminatory exclusion of same-sex couples from this very important institution? And proponents of that discrimination have to offer reasons. And what's more, they have to offer secular reasons. This is not a debate about whether any particular church or synagogue or mosque ought to have any particular position about marriage, because they're all entitled to make that distinction about that position about by themselves. But what they're not entitled to do is to impose that willy-nilly on the government. And so the question remains, what is the reason for that exclusion? And Professor McCarthy mentioned the Nazis, and of course I do have to point out that the Nazis, in one of their first significant pieces of legislation as part of their broader program once they had seized power, was to pass the infamous Nuremberg laws, which were to deny the ability of Jews and so-called Aryans to marry. Marriage has always been used as a weapon of dehumanization against groups of people who are disfavored. Now, marriage has many other parts to its history, many of which have been glorious. It is one of the longest surviving, albeit constantly changing, institution in world history. But it also has been used as a battleground and as a weapon of exclusion, whether it was to deny African Americans not just their ability to marry white people, but their ability to marry even each other as a brand of inferiority, saying that they were not to be treated as fully human and their relationships were not fully worthy, and therefore they could not marry even each other, let alone the patchwork of race laws that came in later that I described to.
I don't believe your right to be married should be affected by the fact that you're infertile. I know that's an argument that's often used, but our side's position is that you are capable of a complementary relationship with a man because you are a heterosexual. And if you found a man that was heterosexual, he would be capable of having that complementary relationship with you. Your physical structure is set up to sustain that, so would his. But you are infertile. you don't fit in with the majority of cases. So, this isn't a one-size-fits-all thing that, you have to be fertile to be married. You just have to be a heterosexual to be married.
Well, that says it all. I have to say, when you wind up quoting Scalia on your side, you got to know something is telling you something. Justice Scalia in Lawrence said that the procreation argument, and we've just heard a demonstration of why, makes no sense. He said it is simply untenable as an argument for perpetuating the exclusion because it is only invoked when it's against gay people and then completely dispensed with when it comes to any other category of people who choose to marry. And I want to point out that the answer from my point of view to your question is, of course you should not be denied the freedom to marry, because people don't just marry for the purposes of sex. They don't just marry for the purposes of having children. People have a mix of reasons for wanting to get married, and just as non-gay people have that mix, so do gay people. It is also true that many gay people are raising children. And if people truly in this country care about children, they would want to assure the protections to those families without regard to whether the parents are gay or non-gay. We shouldn't be punishing kids for having, quote unquote, the wrong kind of parent by denying those families the protections they want, while at the same time we also should be respecting the choices people make to get married, who may be infertile or who may not want to have children, or may be on a second marriage and no longer wish to have more children, or may be old and want to get married to the person they love. And if Bob and Elizabeth Dole and John and Teresa Hines Carey, and for that matter George and Martha Washington, can all get married without having kids, surely there's room for gay people too. No one oppression needs to be compared against any oppression or to establish a hierarchy of oppression in order to say that oppression or discrimination or exclusion are wrong. And again, the court in 1948, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and others have drawn this parallel precisely because we have seen marriage used as a weapon of dehumanization in many contexts, most dramatically, and I absolutely agree with you here, most bitterly throughout American history in the context of race. But again, the Nazis and the Nuremberg Law and other examples one could give show that the issues that are raised here are not necessarily identical, but there are commonalities. And similarly, the voices of the opponents to equality today bear an eerie similarity to the voices of equality and inclusion throughout other similar struggles in American and world history. And Professor McCarthy disclaimed that he himself would have supported the ban on interracial marriage, and he said nobody he knows would have supported that, and I certainly don't cast any judgments on Professor McCarthy or want to use any labels or anything, but it's really striking how today in America it's as if the whole battle over race discrimination in marriage, well, that was different. Everybody agrees that was wrong. But you know what? As recently as a generation ago, it was one of the fiercest, most contested battles in this country, and there were many voices, indeed majority voices, opposing that equality then. And now suddenly that's that, and this is different. Well, I think it's actually very important for people to hear the history and to remember what the claims of exclusion sounded like in other chapters of this country's struggle. When the Supreme Court ruled in the best named case ever, Loving versus Virginia, which Professor Strawson has now assigned you all to read, in that case, when they struck down, finally, race discrimination in civil marriage in this country, polls at the time showed that 70% of the American people opposed interracial marriage. That's how fiercely fought over it was, and that's how important it was for people like us who care about equality to stand up and struggle and achieve these breakthroughs, not belittling history, but claiming it and remembering the lesson that unless we all stand up and make the change we want in the world, we're not going to see it.
I believe that I am fighting for the dignity of human beings by fighting for heterosexual marriage and the exclusivity of heterosexual marriage. I believe that men and women, not for just religious reasons, but just to look at things, were made for each other. They were made physically, physiologically for each other. I believe emotionally they were made for each other. Their bodies go together perfectly. I don't believe one man and another man's body really go together in the same way that a man and a woman's bodies go together. I believe that the dignity of a human being lies in heterosexual relationships. Now, you may completely disagree with me, but the only thing that anybody said tonight that's offended me is when Evan said that the statement on our website, which I've never seen, by the way, but apparently there's a statement on our website endorsing the FMA, is that what it is? Federal Marriage Amendment?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is hateful. Well, I can tell you that there's nobody at the ACLJ that I know that is a hateful person. Virtually everyone I know there could be making a lot more money in private practice, and did make a lot more money in private practice before they're doing what they're doing. So it's important for me to communicate to you that we're not all hateful people because we disagree with you. We disagree with you because we believe that there are very good reasons for having a heterosexual marriage being exclusive. And you know, I think I've given you a lot of examples in my first 15 minutes of why I believe it's so, and I didn't use any religious examples. I never talked about bestiality. I don't know that I talked about, I mentioned the article by Kurtz, which talked about moving toward polyamory with these cases, and I think that they are moving toward polyamory. What I'm finding out here tonight is a lot of people don't see that as the bad thing that I see that as. So that's a kind of a learning experience for me, and it's important that I learn that. But I honestly believe that you know, human dignity lies in this direction, and you believe differently, and I respect you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well,
do you want to comment on that?
Yes,
Evan?
I do. First of all, I certainly did not label any person in this room as hateful, including you, Professor McCarthy. What I said was the constitutional amendment was hateful. The constitutional amendment is hateful. To take our nation's most precious guarantee and propose to amend it for the first time ever in history, to fence out a group of Americans, and let's be very clear, and if you don't realize this, and I take you at your word as a person of good faith that maybe you haven't focused on this aspect of it, and maybe the ACLJ has not focused on it. The constitutional amendment proposes not only to deny gay people the freedom to marry, but also to prevent state and local laws that would in any way provide the legal incidence, very fuzzy wording for a constitution, of marriage. In other words, it is a document, it is an amendment intended to not simply bar the door to full equality, tie the hands of gay people, non-gay people, state legislatures, judges, and future generations when it comes to the equality of gay people with regard to marriage, but to roll back the clock and to put a thumb on the scales against the institution of any measure of protection, large or small. That is a hateful enterprise. It is a hateful enterprise, particularly when being defended by organizations that have existed, as you say, to defend civil rights or their view of civil rights under that very Constitution. Where the dignity of the human being lies is not in any one religious view, though everyone is entitled to their religious view, and that's one of the great things about our country. The dignity lies in respecting that we can differ over these things and still share this planet, and still share the system of laws, and still share the Constitution. There has never been a proposal by gay people or gay organizations to go and amend the Constitution so as to bar the door to other Americans. But instead, we see that reckless assault on this Constitution targeting us.
Would you father? I think kids need fathers. Every study that's come out that's measured what happens to kids without fathers has showed negative results in everything. There's schoolwork. I can't think of the woman that did the longevity study recently, but she concluded that kids without fathers are deficient in virtually every category. The other question was artificial insemination. I feel the same way about that. I mean, beyond the fact that I think the children should be brought into the world by an act of love, not by being, you know, through either test tubes or through artificial insemination, leaving that aside, kids again deserve a mother and a father to be raised by both.
I just have to correct that in fact that's not at all what the studies show. What the studies show is that in general, kids fare better when there are two parents in the family, because the parents can spell each other, they can take breaks, give each other support, they can do things for the kids, they in general bring combined resources that are greater than the resources one parent would bring, and so on. That's not to say that single parents can't and don't do good jobs raising kids, but it is easier in general when there are two parents and the kids benefit.
If one man, one woman is no longer a limitation, then why would you have a limitation on the number of people that would constitute a married partners? And what I'm hearing tonight, I believe, is that there is no opposition really on the part of people who are in favor of same-sex marriage to expanding it to polygamy or polyamory. And I'm not saying that as a, you know, a slur or an attempt to win a point or anything like that. It just appears that, in answer to the question that was asked, that polygamy naturally flows from same-sex marriage, because you're taking away those limitations that you had on marriage being two people of the opposite sex. And that quite naturally is going to lead to polygamy, in my view. And so apparently it's no big deal, and you know, I think that's the direction that we're headed in. I see two things that lie in the future. That, and I think there's another debate that's coming up in the future in which Mr. Wolfson and I would probably be on the same side, and that's the people that don't believe in marriage at all. You know, don't believe that there should be marriage between gay people or heterosexual people.
Should same-sex couples be denied the freedom to marry? What reason does the government have for putting a sex restriction on the choice that the two people make? When race discrimination was battled over in our country, part of our history, the same kinds of cries of diversion were raised. It was said that if we allow interracial couples to marry, it will lead to Scalia's list. It will lead to polygamy. And you know what? It didn't. It didn't, because each kind of exclusion or each discrimination needs to be justified and discussed and debated on its own terms. It is simply no answer to the question of sex discrimination in marriage to keep trying to change the subject to something else. And so when the right wing continues to do that, many of us choose not to launch into that discussion, because the discussion is this discrimination that harms real people here today, same-sex couples, their loved ones, their kids. It was suggested correctly that we ought to show in our country respect for people's choices, and that we ought to respect gay people's loving choices and efforts to build a life together and to find happiness and to withstand the ups and downs and hardships and joys of life. And we ought to respect non-gay people's unions and attempts to do the very same thing. And I deeply agree with that. I think there is room in our country for both. It is not gay people, it is not gay organizations who are standing today in this country proposing an assault on the Constitution. It is not gay people, it is not people who support gay equality, who are urging legislators and judges and presidential candidates to take stands of exclusion and harm against non-gay people's families. So we do not stand today in a position of equality, not just under the law. We do not stand today in a position of equality as far as who is attacking whom. What I hear is that when Professor McCarthy talks about things like two in one flesh and the complementarity of sexual function and all these other kinds of arguments, the only arguments he really made tonight He doesn't hear, because of his own beliefs, that this is a religious worldview. A religious worldview that you, Professor McCarthy, are entitled to have, and that the government should not in any way try to take away. But it is deeply wrong to impose that through the law on other Americans who have a different religious view. The ACLJ purportedly exists to fight for religious freedom and the protection of religious space in our country. It is the ACLJ that ought to be out there defending true freedom of religion, which is that we allow ourselves to disagree on concepts like that while preserving as civil equality what is done by the government. And I urge you to think deeply and to hear that when you are putting these arguments forward, these are not arguments. These are religious beliefs worthy of respect in the religious sphere, but wrong to impose through the weapon of the government.
Many thanks to both our speakers and to the audience.